In our previous video, we covered King Alfred's surprise victory over the Vikings at Edington in 878. This victory both ensured the survival of his kingdom and allowed the West Saxons the breathing room needed to prepare for the next inevitable invasion. Though Guthrum retired to East Anglia after the battle, Wessex still faced a potential attack from elsewhere. Just as Guthrum had successfully carved himself out a kingdom well over a decade after the initial arrival of the Great Heathen Army, another could just as easily come and do the same. Alfred spent the 880s converting the various market towns of his kingdom into burhs, which would act as fortified safe havens and meeting points for local militias. He also forged a lasting alliance with the portion of Mercia still under Anglo-Saxon control, now under the rule of a warlord of unknown origins named Ethelred after the death of King Ceolwulf in around 879. The alliance was sealed by the marriage of Alfred's eldest daughter, Ethelfled, to Ethelred in the early 880s, who began to rule as a vassal of Wessex. Alfred also achieved a similar arrangement with the southern Welsh kingdoms during this time, whose rulers were hemmed in by the expansionist sons of Rhodri the Great in Gwynedd and Powys. The most powerful of these northern Welsh kings, Anarad ap Rhodri, may have allied himself with the Vikings of York against Wessex, before eventually accepting West Saxon vassalage, thus securing Alfred's western border. Ultimately, Guthrum kept the peace with Wessex until his death in 890. However, just 2 years later, the burh system would face its first real test, when two massive fleets of raiders comprised of over 300 longboats under a sea king named Hastein arrived on the Kentish shore. Yet times had changed over the last decade, and Wessex held out. By 896, Hastein's men either left Britain entirely or dispersed into East Anglia. The burh system had worked. Upon his death in 899, Alfred left his kingdom to his eldest son and heir, Edward. The succession was not smooth, as Alfred's nephew Ethelwald also made his claim. He fled north into Northumbrian Danelaw, where he was enthusiastically accepted by the local rulers, who were apparently happy to finally conquer the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom once and for all. Ethelwald gathered an army in Northumbria, and by 901 or 902 sailed south to Essex. Had led to the settlement of a large group of exiles in the lands just to the north of the Mercian-held town of Chester, an old Roman fortress. The Mercians may have hoped for these Irish Vikings to act as a buffer against the ever-present threat of the Danelaw. but by 907 these Vikings had aligned themselves with the Danelaw to besiege Chester. When the Mercian army went north to deal with this new threat, it was Aethelflaed leading them, as Aethelred was incapacitated due to illness. What happened next is unclear, but the Mercians defeated the Vikings at Chester, and now Aethelflaed and Aethelred were firmly in control. The Mercians were going on the offensive. At that time, Edward's son Aethelstan was being fostered by his aunt, Aethelflaed, in Mercia. In 909, he led a raid deep into Viking territory to retrieve the relics of the famed Northumbrian king Oswald. His army also took the opportunity to pillage the lands of Lindsey for 5 weeks before the Vikings in York could react. We're going to talk about Aethelstan in much more detail in the next episode. In 910, the Northumbrians retaliated, launching a massive raid deep into Mercia. They ravaged the countryside and loaded up on plunder before beginning the journey back north. It was then, at a place called Tettenhall, that a combined West Saxon Mercian army caught the Vikings by surprise. In the ensuing bloodbath, the entire leadership of the Viking force was killed, crippling York for years to come. Tettenhall was a turning point in many ways. It was around this time that Aethelred finally passed away, and quite astonishingly, despite being a woman in a militaristic, male-dominated society, Aethelflaed was chosen as his successor, ruling under the title Lady of the Mercians. However, soon she was forced to relinquish control of London to Wessex. Aethelflaed would continue to rule, though as she had no male heir, it was the beginning of the end for independent Mercia. For the next 8 years, she tirelessly dedicated her time to building burhs not only along the frontier with the 5 boroughs to the east, but also against the Welsh kingdoms to the west. A state of perpetual warfare existed with the 5 boroughs of eastern Mercia during this time, with occasional raids reported from the towns of Leicester and Bedford into western Mercia. Edward, meanwhile, was finally ready to go on the offensive against the Vikings on his own border. Between 911 and 913, he moved his forces by land and by sea into Essex, fortifying the town of Malden and attempting to bring the area under full West Saxon control. For the first time since the coming of the Northmen, Wessex was gaining new lands, and Malden would become a base from which he could attack East Anglia. Yet, in 914, any potential attacks Aethelflaed or Edward might have wanted to make suddenly came crashing to a standstill. Across the Channel in Brittany, a massive Viking fleet had just conquered the entire region, extinguishing its ruling family, and now, under the leadership of 2 warlords named Roald and Ottir, it was coming to Britain. Sailing up through the Bristol Channel, they headed into the River Severn in an attempt to take the Mercians by surprise. Yet, once again, Aethelflaed was ready for them, pushing them out of Mercia and into Wales, killing Roald in the process. Edward pursued Ottir and his remaining vessels all the way to the island of Flatholme near Cardiff. Finally, Ottir gave up on England and went across the sea to Ireland. The stage was now set for the final confrontation of the war. By 914, Edward II was making inroads into the 5 boroughs, forcing the submission of some of the Vikings of Bedford and Northampton. By 917, both Edward and Aethelflaed were ready for their final assaults upon the Vikings. A large force of Danes from the southern portion of the 5 boroughs allied itself with the East Anglians, who finally decided to make a move. They attempted to mirror the success of the Saxons by building their own burh at Tempsford in Bedfordshire. Within weeks, however, Edward's forces stormed the burh, killing the East Anglian king, and swept onwards to take the whole of East Anglia and southeastern Mercia. Aethelflaed was also on the move. By mid-917, she marched her now elite army across the border and directly towards the borough of Derby, where they laid siege to the town. After a fierce battle, the town fell, and with it, large swathes of eastern Mercia. By 918, Leicester had also submitted, followed by the other 3 boroughs of Stamford, Nottingham and Lincoln. Under Aethelflaed, Mercia had finally completed its reconquest, and now found itself with nearly the same borders it had prior to the coming of the Vikings, yet she didn't stop there. In the summer of 918, the Vikings of York agreed to submit to Aethelflaed. Ultimately, the deal never materialized, as Aethelflaed passed away that same year. She was succeeded by her only child, a daughter named Elfwin. By 918, all of England south of the Humber was under Anglo-Saxon control. Edward marched north to Tamworth to seize Elfwin. She was placed in a monastery for life, and Mercia was finally incorporated into Edward's growing kingdom. Then, like Alfred before him, Edward achieved the fealty of the 5 Welsh kingdoms, thus uniting most of the land south of the Humber for the first time in history. All that remained in England under Viking control was the Kingdom of Northumbria, and it would have become the next target for Edward. Though just as Edward was annexing Mercia into his ever-growing Anglo-Saxon realm, the Dublin Norse, members of the soon-to-be-feared Eöfydd dynasty of Ireland, annexed York in a lightning attack. This created a new threat to the burgeoning United England. Thank you for watching the 3rd video in our series on the Viking invasions of Britain. Don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss the new videos in this series. You can also click the bell icon to get a notification about our videos, as we always have something new for you on Sunday mornings. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us directly via YouTube by pressing the sponsorship button below the video, or buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.